Mr. President.
Senator from South Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would ask unanimous consent that I be recognized to speak for up to 10 minutes.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. My colleagues today have all had the same concern, and that is that while we recognize the need to address the debt limit that our country is now up against, we also recognize that the defense of our country is a critical and necessary part of our responsibility as well. The concern that many of us have is that the proposal right now, in order to raise the debt limit, is that part of it has a series of conditions with regards to what happens to the dollars that it takes to actually defend our country for the next 2 years. We want to be able to raise the debt limit. We recognize that. But we also have to address the need for the defense of our country. And why should, as a part of the negotiation, why should we be required to look at a reduction in the amount of dollars necessary for our young men and women to be able to defend our country? And yet, within the provisions of this bill, there is a reduction of up to 1% of the existing budget if we don't do an appropriations process. And yet, in order to do the appropriations process, we have to have 12 separate bills. The 12 separate bills all have to be passed. Now, the United States Senate is not known for necessarily doing anything on time. And yet, here we come up to the end of the fiscal year in October, and we haven't seen appropriation bills on the floor yet. What we need to be able to do, rather than to have a 1% reduction in defense, is have an agreement that we will at least allow the appropriation bills to come from the Appropriations Committee, come to the floor of the Senate, so that we can address them, up or down, with the appropriate amendments on them, but to have a full discussion and to do it in a timely fashion. So number one, let's address the debt limit, but let's not penalize our ability to defend our country, or perhaps more appropriately to say, let's not limit the ability of our young men and women in uniform to defend our country. My colleagues have done a great job of explaining what happens here if we don't do our job correctly with regard to this particular bill. Number one, if we go to a continuing resolution, our defense budget goes down. But number two, under the provisions of this bill, the non-defense portions of this budget could actually go up. And so there's an incentive, an unfair incentive built into this to spend more on domestic programs and to spend less to defend our country, which is our primary responsibility. How do we fix it at this late stage of the game? Number one, there are supplementals that are absolutely necessary. We have aggressive authoritarians throughout the world that are right now looking to see whether or not we are prepared to support our allies and those individuals who are on the front lines, specifically in Ukraine, specifically looking as well in the South Pacific, and looking at Taiwan and doing our best to turn Taiwan into a porcupine, making it much less of a possibility that China will invade Taiwan. But the other piece of this, along with that, is that we have to do an appropriations process where we actually get a chance to look at the defense bill and our other appropriations bills in a timely fashion, so that we do not have a continuing resolution in which the defense of our country loses ground, making it more vulnerable, or our country more vulnerable, and a more challenging job for the young men and women who wear the uniform of this country. With that, I just want to say thank you to my colleagues who have laid out some great numbers for all of us and who clearly have laid out a path forward, a commitment by leadership that the appropriations process be completed in a timely fashion, and that there is a recognition that supplemental funding will be necessary to confront aggressive authoritarians throughout the world. And with that, excuse me, Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor. Note the absent.